විහිදෙන ජීවිතේ.
Good evening and welcome. We meet in the wake of unprecedented economic turmoil, parliamentary chaos, a foreign exchange crisis, a severe shortage of essentials, public outcry and indignation, and island-wide protests calling for accountability and a conscionable set of legislators. Now, while a resurgence in public consciousness is absolutely amazing, what must happen after the protests? How can Sri Lanka continue within a parliamentary framework and structure which is more acceptable to the public, where there is actual accountability, whilst honouring its debt repayments and reversing the crisis in a scientific manner with the help and assistance and guidance of industry experts and multi-sectoral stakeholders in a manner which is in the best interest of the people. Now, the format of this brand new show is slightly different. We will actively attempt to be solution-oriented to issues faced by the people, and we will go through issues raised by the people on various platforms. We will also be crossing over live to a protest site during this show as well, and look at possible ways of resolving conflict with the help of our stellar panel of guests who you will meet momentarily. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the People's Forum. Let's take a look at your guests tonight. We are joined by Ambika Satkunanathan, human rights advocate and a former commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. We are also joined by Dr. Gehan Gunathilaka, attorney at law, and finally Dr. Dinesha Samararatna, attorney at law and senior lecturer at the University of Colombo. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Thank you so much for being on the first episode of the People's Forum. Before I start my round of questions, I'd like to read a few tweets creating long-term change.
Well, I think it's very important to understand where this all starts. So, like you said, this is about accountability. But to actually have accountability, you have to understand who is responsible, right? And I think if you go back to 2019, there was an overwhelming majority given to the current president, and that was entrenched in a parliamentary election in August 2020. So this particular government then went on to concentrate power through the 20th Amendment, and the executive presidency is as powerful as it has ever been. So the decisions that follow, and I'm not saying that before this government came into power there weren't causes that have led to this particular crisis, but the decisions that followed are directly the decisions that led to this crisis, right? Or at least let's say it exacerbated this crisis. It failed to provide a solution before this crisis erupted. Now, if I were to take a step back and ask the question, is there a problem in the structure of our government and governance system, the concentration of power in one individual, the concentration of power where you do not have separation of powers and checks and balances, can lead to a situation where if you make mistakes, there's no one around you to deliberate with and finally come to a solution that is actually viable. So if you're thinking about this moment as creating an opportunity for long-term change, I would say that this is a singular opportunity to look at our presidential system and change it for good. So this is a very narrow window, and I think if the opportunity is seized, we could be looking at long-term change.
Amazing. I'd like to move my attention to Dr. Dinesha. Chamal Asela Pereira on Twitter says, Parliament today, no one talked about solutions to the power cut. No one talked about how to settle the outstanding 1,000 million USD ISB in July. No one talked about solutions to the fuel crisis. However, they talked about how insecure MPs are, conspiracies about the protests and usual mudslinging. Chandani Kirinde adds, no confidence motions, impeachment motions, all available options for opposition, but hours wasted on debates with no comprehensive plan placed before the House to address the urgent needs of the people. It's an utter waste of time. Let's address this.
So Sonali, there are multiple ways of explaining what's happening in Parliament today and also yesterday. As Gehan mentioned, since 1978 we've had an executive presidency that has dominated the state, and as the executive presidency did that, it also undermined the legislature and the judiciary. So the result that we are seeing today in Parliament is that the undermining of the legislature, the taking over of the legislature by this all-powerful office has brought Parliament to a place where it is failing to act as a check. It's failing to live up to its mandate and is not even able to respond to what's happening on the street. Related to that is the failure of political parties. In a democracy, political parties have a central role to play, but throughout our independence period, what we have seen is a gradual erosion of the political party mechanism. And 2016 onwards, we've also seen a radical change in the political party structure, and we've seen the two traditional political parties eventually take a backseat, a new party coming in with a very different kind of approach to governance. So these are two key factors that have brought Parliament to where it is, but I may add, at this stage, Parliament has an extremely important role to play. And if Parliament fails to play that role, we will be in an even greater crisis.
In simple words, if any of our 225 MPs are watching this show, in simple language, can you tell us what must these 225 parliamentarians do?
So in my view, there are two things that need to be done. The first is that Parliament with one voice must impress upon the President to resign, heeding to the calls of the people. Second point, the abolishing of the executive presidency. Both of these measures have to take place as soon as possible if we are to create the structural change that we need in order to address this crisis. It's a precondition, Sonali. At this stage, it's a precondition.
All right. Ambika, on Twitter, Namini Vijayadasa says, ask yourselves one thing though. If you had gas, electricity, fuel, the imports, all your fun, would your eyes ever have opened to everything? I'd like to draw your attention on how different the situation is in the south and the west, as juxtaposed with the north and the east of the country. When it comes to freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, these are constitutionally enshrined rights. Protesters can exercise these rights, well enough in Colombo and suburbs. But the reality is, there's a dire reality faced by people in the north and east when they want to protest for something legitimate. Take us through this reality which people have now sort of realized.
I mean, I agree completely with Namini because I feel the same. And as you said, the protests are unprecedented in that in my living memory, do not remember such people in large numbers protesting. I think that is a positive thing, whereby they realize, and particularly the younger generation, what it means to be a citizen. That we do need to hold our elected representatives accountable, because I think we have been a democracy, but those democratic values have not been internalized. So in that sense, this is definitely a moment which I think we need to harness. But at the same time, what drove them there? When they speak of accountability, does that also include accountability for human rights violations, for the violations that took place during the war?
Right.
And where those issues are concerned, there is clearly still a huge awareness gap in the South. Right. And a simple example is when those four armed men on motorbikes with guns tried to go into the protest and the policemen stopped them, there was outrage on social media, and people were saying, since when is it legal to do this? And since when? And I couldn't help but tweet, actually it's been going on for a very long time. So there is that huge awareness gap.
Right.
And I think that is what we need to address. And if we are to ensure that these sentiments, or wanting to hold your elected representatives accountable, it persists even after the gas, the fuel and the electricity comes on. I think a lot has been done by the political parties, by civil society, by our education system.
Right. And now these round of protests saw a phenomenal input by the youth of the country. Dinesha, what more can be done in terms of creating a sort of knowledge database among the youth? Because we saw the manner in which young law students, NGOs came out saying, look, here's what you need to do if someone's getting arrested. Here's what you need to do if you are tear gassed. And these were PDFs that were being shared on social media trilingually. So we saw this resurgence of empathetic togetherness also. How do we make sure that this is not just until we get our LP gas and our milk powder and our imported perfumes?
Yeah. So two things there, I think, Sonali. One is very closely tied to your question to Ambika and her response. I think there is a moment here where we can talk about the fact that what happens to those who are placed in the margins of a polity is a good signal about what can eventually happen to you. And we are all realizing that today. For decades, people chose to ignore what was not right before their very eyes, or somebody was dispensable because they had challenged the state or the government in one form or another. But today, those issues of rule of law, those issues of accountability, those issues of violence are being faced by a greater number of people. So while that suffering is tragic and should not have taken place, if you are looking to the future, we now have a way of explaining the problem of governance in Sri Lanka to a greater number of people. And also then on the other hand, globally the conversation was that the younger generations are now disinterested in politics, that they are more self-absorbed.
Yeah, there's apathy, ignorance.
Yes. But what we are seeing today is very different.
Absolutely.
And this is despite, because I'm from academia, I think I can say this, despite in general our universities and our schools struggling to create the kind of civic consciousness that we would like to see in a democracy.
Right.
Why that is the case, I really don't know, but it is very clear that the youth are engaged. But that brings us back to politics. So we are also now seeing, if I'm reading what I'm observing accurately, we are also seeing a sense of disenchantment arise.
Right.
And that's also worrying. So if, coming back to our political institutions, if they are not going to deliver, young people are going to feel disenchanted. And I don't know where that would lead. So before we think in terms of long-term knowledge generation, knowledge sharing, etc., I think that is an immediate concern that has to be addressed. People need hope, whatever your age. And there is an extent to which people on the street can take us. I mean, you may disagree with me, but once people do have gas, electricity, milk, whatever it is that we are constantly running short of, I don't think there's anything wrong with them going back to their usual lives. A democracy must work that way.
Sure.
Public institutions are there to deliver.
Right, yeah.
So they need to come out like this when institutions fail. But in order for them to do that, there has to be background work that has to be done. And young people have done that for themselves. Really, some of these organizations are run by young people. So I sometimes wonder whether we need to step in at all in that sense.
Okay.
They are seeking information, and they're going to the people that they need to go to get the information. But I think what we have to do as much as we can is to impress on our public institutions to deliver, and deliver right now.
Okay. Gehan, I'd like to ask you now, the existing parliamentary structure where there are 225 elected representatives and nationalist MPs, people are also disenchanted with them. So the slogans say 225 go home. So how do we tackle that in a sort of constitutional manner?
So that's a really interesting question, and I've also been thinking about this. I think it's really important to understand where the responsibility lies for this crisis.
Right.
In a situation where you concentrate power, and power is with the president and with his party, they enjoy almost a 2/3 majority in parliament, there can't be any doubt or ambiguity as to who is responsible for the decisions that has led to this particular situation. So I think the emotional reaction sometimes is to spread that responsibility across the entire institution,
Right.
which I think is not the correct way of going about this.
Okay.
There is a short-term solution that is needed, and that is definitely a reform of the executive presidency. I agree with Dinesha there. But there's also an immediate solution required.
Okay.
And that immediate solution, like it or not, must come from the present government. It can't be spread across 225 MPs. Because this present government brought on this problem, it must also deliver the solution. And we all know, I'm not an economist, but anyone who listens to the economists who are speaking out, we all know that the reforms that are necessitated by this crisis are going to be painful. They're going to be burdensome.
Right.
And if these burdens are going to be imposed on the people, it has to come from those who are responsible. Now, by spreading the responsibility across 225 MPs, we forget who is actually responsible, and then we start making demands that are not connected to the actual responsible parties. So I think it's very important that the immediate solution is that once the president, and I really do hope that the president heeds the call of the people and steps down, once he does step down, I think it's very important that the present government sets up a governance structure, a new government, to deliver on the short-term solutions. And that means negotiating with the IMF, negotiating with our creditors, and actually making sure that the fuel and the gas and the electricity comes back to the people. Now, once they do that, there's no doubt that they will still be very unpopular. But that's their responsibility. So accountability is not just getting people to step down, it's also compelling them to actually deliver solutions. Now, I think what is happening at the moment is there's a lot of bartering and negotiation, inviting opposition to come in and solve this problem, which I think no reasonable opposition should do. Why should the opposition take on this burden and then deliver burdensome solutions and then in 2.5 years face an election? That's quite ridiculous. No reasonable opposition should do that. Ultimately, this is the government's responsibility, and the government does have competent ministers, competent people. They need to put them in charge of delivering on the immediate solution. Now, while that is happening, I agree with Dinesha. I think the reform agenda has to continue. Whoever who occupies that position of the presidency should only be a stopgap solution, because while that occupation takes place, the presidency has to be reformed. That's not going to happen in 1 week. That's not going to happen in 2 weeks. There's a whole process that needs to take place. And I think in that context, we're looking at, a couple of months of that process taking place. So it is very important that that's taking place. There's short-term solutions, there's of course long-term solutions, and there are immediate steps. And I don't see those immediate steps being taken by a government who got everything it wants. This government got everything. It got an executive presidency with all the concentration of power through the 20th Amendment. It got a near 2/3 majority. So with all that power, it led us down this path to crisis. Now provide the solutions.
Pragmatically speaking, what you just said it makes a world of sense, but how do we implement this? How does one go about telling the government, look, this is what you need to implement? If they are ill-advised, as they have been over these past couple of years, what then?
So Sonali, I'm not so sure this is about being ill-advised. I think there's a bravado that this government has sort of adopted as its MO. It has approached the international community with this sense that we can do it ourselves, right? And that is essential. That arrogance is what has led us to this point. So I don't think they're ill-advised. I think there's an incompetence here that's going on, and there's an arrogance. Having said that, I take your point. This is not going to be an easy thing to pitch. It's a very nuanced point to pitch. The simplicity of the slogan calling for the president to resign, I think, is a clear demand. And I don't think these protests are going to dissipate unless that demand is met. But beyond that, calling for all 225 MPs to step down is not practical, right? So we have to actually have a solution within the MPs that are still from the government side, where they set up a government where certain people who have not been targeted by these protests take up the mantle, take up the responsibility, and then deliver the solution in the short term.
Okay, perfect. On that note, we're going for a short commercial break, but before that, just to update you that we will be crossing over live to Newsfirst Senator, who is standing by in Kolpiti. So that takes place after this commercial break. Stay with us.
Thank you, Sonali. Right now I'm at the Kolpiti junction, where a protest organized by the general public is being staged. Now, these protests have been happening for the past few weeks, and even today one such protest took place at the entrance to the parliamentary complex and at the Nelumpakuna junction and at the Independence Square as well. Now, these people are simply saying that the general public has had enough. They cannot bear the brunt of this economic pressure, and these people are protesting with the slogan "Gota, go home." I'm reporting to you from the Kollupiti junction. As you can see, vehicles that are driving by this protest are honking in support of these protesters. I'm Sanitha Senanayaka. We're ready to give you more information from the Kollupiti junction. Until then, I'm Sanitha Senanayaka reporting for News First, where the people come first.
We'll be crossing over live momentarily. We're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back.
COVID-19 සඳහා ආරක්ෂිත පියවර නිතරම හොඳින් සබන් යොදා දෑත් සෝදන්න. සබන් හෝ විසබීජනාශක මධ්‍යසාරයක් භාවිතා කර දෑත් පිරිසිදු කරන්න. සෑම විටම අන් අය සමග මීටරයක දුරස්ථභාවයක් පවත්වා ගන්න. හැකි සෑම විටම නිවසේ රැඳී සිටින්න. නිරතුරුවම නිවැරදිව මුඛාවරණ පළඳින්න.
Supporting rural education means building a nation's future. And together with the people of Sri Lanka, Gammadda is leading from the front. Development of preschools in Ramba Ava and Isin Basagama, both in rural Anuradhapura. A preschool developed in Attan Kadavala in the North Central Province. Clean drinking water for the children of the Maligattena School in Valimata, Bandarvela. A library for the youngsters at the Kumbuk Oya Rural School between rural Polonnaruwa and Matale. Clean water for school children in Hambegamua, Munragala. Classrooms for students at the primary school in Ralapanava, Anuradhapura. The complete development of the Sindati Mata School in Kalpitiya, Puttalam. These are a few examples of Gammadda's action and impact. Thanks to you, the people. Gammadda. By by the people, for the people.
You're with the People's Forum. We cross over live now to Newsfirst Senitha, who joins us from Kolpiti. Senitha, what are the people saying?
Thank you. I'm joining you live again from the Kolpiti Junction, where a group of people are staging a protest. Now we're ready to talk to these people who are here at this protest. As you can see, most of these people who are here protesting are young people. This sign says, "Don't fool us, repeal the 20th Amendment, abolish the president," and so on. And we can read more signs. "You have stolen our money, now you are stealing our future. Enough." No, the message seems to be very clear. Tell me, it's a good Wednesday night. Why have you decided to come out to the streets? Why did you decide to take matters to the streets instead of staying at home tonight?
I think it's important for us to come out and advocate that other people come out as well, because it's important for the people of Sri Lanka to know that, you know, what these leaders are doing are not right. We need action, tangible change, like abolishing the PTA, like abolishing the 20th Amendment, abolishing executive presidency. We need for leaders to be educated, and I think that it's important for all of us to come out and show that there are multiple demands, there are multiple needs, and those needs should be met. And you know, it's not going to happen if people aren't willing to come out after work, after school, and show up for the rest of the country.
Thank you. Nandana, can we get a shot of this sign? It says, "You promised one country, one law." Not no country, no laws. Sir, tell me, suppose if the president and the government resign tomorrow, what do you think should happen after that?
Well, I would always say that we need a new youth. A youth should lead this country. Well, we have seen everyone. We have seen like everyone, but definitely Rajapaksas, they have to leave because they are not doing any good. But at the same time, we would also like to see some good youth coming, and we could hopefully see a bright future then. Without all the middle-aged, the old people ruling the country, we would like to see some youth actually ruling the country for change.
All right. Thank you. As you can see, there is no traffic congestion here. It seems that these vehicles that are honking in support of these protesters. Now, this sign says, "Venasa Samaru, Vividattve Age Karamu." Gota out, Rajapakshas out. And we are reporting to you live from the Kolpiti Junction, where a group of people are engaging in this protest, mostly young people, and they are simply protesting with the sign. They say that they have had enough, and these vehicles are not, these vehicles that are driving by this location seem to be honking in support of these protesters as well. I'm reporting to you live from the Kolpiti Junction. I'm Senitha Senanayaka, reporting for News First, where the people come first.
So, Ambika, one of the key demands that we have seen throughout these protests has been those seeking young leadership. And if we take the situation internationally, we've seen certain countries where they have rejected, where a majority have rejected the establishmentarian sort of party politics and just crossed over to people with sometimes no political background. How do we encourage young leadership, given that most of our key ministers, key parliamentarians are probably over the age of 65, 75?
I think, well, it has a lot to do with our political culture and also our electoral system, because we need to also reform our electoral system. The way it is right now, it is also not easy, for instance, for an independent candidate to contest and win. Even if you're part of a party, it depends on, you might struggle to get a nomination. Even if you do get the nomination, you are someone who will need to have a lot of financial resources in order to be able to win, because of the way the electoral system is, the constituencies are. So I think without changing the power structure, the power dynamics are actually stacked against an individual, the complete outsider with no political connections and no money winning. I think that is part of it. Then of course we have political parties, which themselves are not democratic at all. They do give nominations to older people, people who are connected, and you will see we have second, third generation politicians. It's like a legacy, and also there is a huge sense of entitlement. We feel that particularly even with the Rajapaksas, the sense of entitlement to that. So I think political parties, and also women, because women might work at the lower rungs of the party, but where the central committees are concerned, where the nomination committees are concerned, women are not part of it. Women are not given nominations. Even if they are, they're not particularly supported by the parties, so they would need to bring their family name and money if they want to contest and win. Then of course our general political culture itself. I'm glad to see that the young people seem to have a different notion of accountability, what your value system. Whereas in Sri Lanka it is operated as a patronage, culture of patronage, right? And public institutions are used as means of dispensing patronage, which is why I think it is not enough to just abolish the executive presidency, because our public institutions have been politicized and they are quite dysfunctional. Having been part of a public institution for 5 years and having had to interact with pretty much every single public institution there was, from the military to the police to the Department of Education, I can tell you there is a huge problem there in terms of politicization, lack of independence, lack of efficiency, and of course our public service is very bloated. Lack of accountability. So I think you need to also change that. But once again, abolishing the executive presidency, I think, is only the first step. There is a lot more to do, and it has to do not just with laws, rules and regulations, but values and culture.
Continuing this same question, Gehan, I'd like to ask you, now if we take the voters, especially in rural Sri Lanka, you walk up to them and say, right, if you vote for me, I'll give you a job in this department. I'll make sure that your children are development officers. People are so helpless that they consider it okay to then go on and vote for that person. So that's what's sort of happening. You give a bottle of arak and people come to your protests. So creating this attitudinal shift is not something that can be done overnight, right? Because people are genuinely struggling to make ends meet. So obviously if you give them a bat packet and an arakku kala, they'll come for your demonstration.
Sure, and I think you're right about the time frame involved in ambitious reforms. Right, so as I said before, there are short-term reforms, there are some long-term reforms, and there are immediate needs.
Right.
And I think some of the more ambitious cultural changes that we're talking about require commitment over a long period of time, because culture doesn't change overnight. Institutional culture has been entrenched in Sri Lanka because it's been this way for a very long time. For example, the public service is the way it is, not because of changes that this administration brought in. It's because of changes that have taken place since the early 70s, right? So it's a long time coming, and therefore to reform it will also take a generation. So there's a temptation here, and that temptation is to look at this political moment and try to get everything that you imagine that you want changed also changed in this moment. And that's where we can really lose focus.
Right.
The focus needs to be on remedying the economic problem.
Yeah.
And that will take some time, it will take some hardship and a lot of burdens. It also requires an immediate reform of the presidency. And that, I think, is a short-term project, and it can be done in the short term. And then we have to be ready for an election. Remember, we don't even have paper to print for exams. There's no question of having an election now. We just don't have the money to do it. So which means we're stuck with this lot. And ousting them is not going to improve our situation dramatically. The president needs to step down, the prime minister needs to step down, because their names are being called out by the protesters. It's very clear that them stepping down will calm the situation. And I think they need to really, if they have any semblance of care for this country, they need to heed the people. But apart from that, the government needs to deliver the solution. And we, as much as it's tempting to really want a massive change, which I think is very important, that massive change is going to come over a period of time and is not going to come in this political moment. And I think we're setting ourselves up for more disappointment if we do demand that kind of change and not get it.
Dr. Dinesha, the recent social media ban, the recent state of emergency that was put in place, much to the indignation of the general public of the Republic, juxtaposed with the rights enshrined in the Constitution and the practical lack of implementation of these fundamental rights. I mean, it's almost as though these are theoretical constructs which no one really cares about upholding. Speak to us about it.
Yeah, but before I speak to that question, I just also want to add to the discussion that you all just had. So on how we characterize voters in Sri Lanka, while what you described may be partly true, we must not forget that the youth of this country in 71, throughout the 30-year-long war, in 88, 89, came out and spoke loud and clear and were willing to sacrifice their lives and did sacrifice their lives. It was really a traumatic experience for the whole country if you stop to think about it, and we could even argue that all of us are touched by it even if we were not in the thick of it. So I don't know whether we can paint the Sri Lankan voters with a few brushes.
Sure.
Voters and the citizens have spoken. I mean, if you take the Youth Commission report, and I mean, I think a few months ago I was reading it and I was struck by the fact that I could have been reading it today about this moment, and much of it would have been true, and this was written more than 2 decades ago. So we need to remember that if we are to generalize about the non-urban Sri Lankans, they have been speaking loud and clear for a very long time, but they have also been exploited. So just on that, but coming back to the fundamental rights guarantees in our constitution. So if you had asked me this question last week, I would have probably said yes, they have by and large been theoretical constructs. Even our Supreme Court has occasionally upheld it and sort of handed down remarkably good jurisprudence. But if you look at the system as a whole, our fundamental rights guarantees have failed the people by and large. And there are different reasons for that. But over the last few days, we've seen a series of events which have made us pause. Sri Lanka has been ruled by emergency since the 70s, with a few breaks in between. And we saw that same declaration of emergency being issued and then withdrawn or revoked. We saw social media ban, again not a new thing, has been used in the past, being imposed and then withdrawn. So that tells us that we are indeed in unprecedented times. But as Gehan pointed out, as Ambika pointed out, we can't now stretch this moment to try and make it solve all our problems, or to say that everything is now real, that our fundamental rights guarantees are real. People in this moment are pushing. They are neglecting their work, they are neglecting their personal lives, and they are all engaged. But that's not going to be for very long. And when that ceases, for whatever reason, we are again left with institutions. I'm sorry to keep coming back to institutions, but if we want to be a constitutional democracy, ultimately we need institutions and we need a culture. But some things take time, and as Gehan has been repeatedly saying, we have point out the factor of time and identify what can be done now and be realistic about what cannot be done right now too.
Ambika, when the protesters get tired of protesting, the public outcry will probably reduce. What needs to happen then?
Okay, before that, may I also just add to what Dinesha said about
Sure,
the state of emergency? Because I think the state of emergency is also very linked to the executive, because the public security ordinance is once again something that needs to be reformed, that gives wide and excessive powers to the president. And during the constitutional reform process, we attempted to do that, quite unsuccessfully. And although the state of emergency has been revoked, first Mahinda Rajapaksa, I'm just talking the last 15 years or so, even after the state of emergency lapsed, they used a provision in the public security ordinance whereby the president only has to issue a gazette monthly to call out the armed forces to maintain law and order. So pretty much involving or giving powers to the military to do policing effectively. Now, Mahinda Rajapaksa did that for a few years. President Sirisena did that once again when the state of emergency lapsed in August 2019. And President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has been doing that every single month since he was elected. This is something that has gone largely unnoticed. No one seems to know about it or care about it. But the last gazette was issued on the 21st of March. So it will lapse on the 22nd of April. So once again, maybe we need to also agitate to ensure that that gazette is not reissued. What we need to do once the protests stop, I think in order for the protests to stop, clearly as Gehan said, the president does need to step down, the prime minister does need to step down. Because with the two of them at the helm, I really don't think that any other caretaker government or bringing in, even if the opposition parties agree, cabinet or a unity government coalition, whatever you like to call it, would turn out to be a farce. So they would definitely need to step down. And it's as they've already said, you have an interim government, you have to wait. Also, we have to ensure that we do this constitutionally, within the constitutional framework. And we do not, because even during Yahapalana, there were times when that was not done. And I do not agree with that, because we cannot ask for the rule of law and then when it's expedient, ignore the constitution. And the parliament cannot be dissolved until 2.5 years are up. So I think we need, and we cannot afford to have an election. So those are things that need to happen. But one point I think that we need to say is, yes, we need to have our immediate concerns, and we cannot try to do everything at the same time. But what has often happened during reform processes in the past, including during Yahapalana, is that what we call euphemism is like pragmatism, right? We say, yes, this is only what we can do, and then we forget about everything else when it gets difficult. And that is where, throughout our history, whether it was during CK after 94, 2001, 2002, and even 2015, that is when everything starts going off the rails. So I think that commitment, and that is not just political parties, it's also civil society needs to hold them accountable. Regrettably, civil society failed to do that during each of these reform processes as well.
Gehan, simultaneously we see a youth movement to encourage young leaders to get into politics. So there are training institutes where people are educated on the local government election laws, for example, which is a very positive trend, because we see young lawyers, doctors, other professionals, activists from not just the cities but also from villages, sort of very passionate about policy making and joining politics. So how do we then create this attitudinal shift again, where now, for example, we have these MPs who are kudukarayas and convicted criminals, and the list goes on, nefarious characters. How do we move from this lot of bad eggs to sort of infuse this new generation of youth and professionals who are genuinely passionate about creating a positive change for the country?
So Sonali, I think if I were to be optimistic about this political moment, I think there seems to be a realization that we have to move away from the caliber of politicians that we're putting in parliament.
Right.
I think that realization is there. I don't agree that we should call for all 225 MPs to step down.
Sure.
But I think that call is also reflecting a realization that the caliber needs to change.
Right.
Now, if what you're saying is true, and there are young people that are really taking politics seriously, learning about it, throwing themselves into it, I think that's really hopeful, because there certainly seems to be a realization that today's politician is corrupt. Today's politician has criminal connections. From the top to the bottom, there are people who are engaging in exploitation of others. So I think this moment may also produce a longer process or project where people will come forward and at least contest elections to try and give the public options. But again, that's a very long-term project.
Correct.
Right? And I think the political culture is not going to change easily. What we're seeing here today, imagine what we're seeing here today is reflective of 1 million or 2 million people.
Okay.
That's still not the whole of the country.
Right.
So there may be another element out there that still suffers from inertia, and we have been surprised in elections before. We shouldn't assume that this is going to immediately do away with the sort of patronage politics that we have at the moment. But I think it's important to also be optimistic.
Okay.
And I think it is possible to say that people will come to realize that they can't trust the average politician and the caliber of politicians that are up for election, and they have to actually get into politics and provide alternatives for people to actually choose. So there's a lot to be optimistic about.
One of our viewers, Zinda Mazin, has an observation. She says, if a commoner makes these mistakes, what a crime it would be. Why doesn't it go both ways? There should be fair and just rules implemented. We want a country free of corruption and injustice. Indeed, Zinda. I'd like to now take these last 5 minutes to ask the three of you for the quick takeaways from this show, because I at the very inception I said that I'd like this show to be solution oriented, so that even if it's an 18-year-old watching this show, he or she would understand and comprehend what now needs to be done for this country to progress forward. Dinesha, what next?
So 2 things I've said all along. The president needs to resign. We have to abolish the executive presidency.
Gehan?
I think protests need to be sharp and stick to the messaging. We should not spread ourselves too thin, and I agree there needs to be a resignation from the president, and his government needs to set up the immediate solution, while a parallel process of reforming the presidency needs to be championed by the opposition.
And just to reiterate what you said at the beginning of the show, because I think it's important for also young protesters who have different placards that they just carry, you're saying that it's not practical for all 225 parliamentarians to be asked to go home, all right? Just reiterate that point.
And also it's not the responsibility of all 225 parliamentarians in terms of this crisis, right? This crisis is a crisis that was created by the government, who enjoyed an executive presidency through the 20th Amendment and nearly 2/3 majority. So I think we have to get the solution from them and not spread ourselves too thin, even in terms of accountability and responsibility across the institution of Parliament.
Amazing. And Ambika?
Well, advocating for change, I think it's important to also stick within the constitutional framework, to respect that and to respect the rule of law. And for the protesters, it is fantastic that people are coming out, but to ensure or to try to keep this a sense of civic duty going. And that means also, for instance, a simple thing, and the viewer's comment. People demand accountability, but they often don't hold themselves accountable.
Sure.
A simple example I always give is in terms of bribes, right? Policeman stops you. Not many would think much about handing the policeman 500 rupees. That's corruption. You are helping make the institution and processes dysfunctional. So I think it's important to also check our own actions and see how we contribute to this mass dysfunctional system that we have created, to try to do things differently.
And I think we should also encourage the protesters to ensure inclusivity when they protest, to not resort to violence, to
language, Sonali, and language. This whole thing about, you know, pissek, and I've seen sexist, misogynist signs, which is all, it's reflective of our own society. But I think at this moment, it also excludes people, it harms others.
Absolutely.
So, yes, definitely.
All right. On that note, we wrap up the first episode of the People's Forum. We truly hope you benefited from the content of this show. Thank you so much, Ambika Satkunanathan, Dr. Gehan Gunathilaka, and Dr. Dinesha Samararatna for being a part of this absolutely fantastic discourse. We'll see you again soon. Thank you and good night.